What was the first major news story you remember as a kid? Story 1. 9/11. I still remember quite clearly how I found out. I got home from school. I live in the UK and turned the TV on as any other 8-year-old would do, and there weren't any children's programming on the main channels. Mum entered the room and she quickly realized what was happening. The 5 of us, me, my parents, and my 2 brothers, sat in front of the TV for what felt like ages, unable to move away from the absolute horror unfolding right in front of us. This was going to be my reply as well. Of course, I didn't understand the broader implications back then. How could I be, with being much younger? All I remember is every adult being incredibly concerned and worried, and I couldn't bring myself to stop watching the impacts, despite my family's best attempts to stop me from doing so. I'm still feeling this inexplicable feeling of dread watching the footage. As a small kid, I didn't realize I was watching a defining moment of history unfold. Now I know I watched a moment that changed the world forever. Same, but we were in Japan, since Dad was in the Navy, so we lived on a military base. I remember waking up panicking because I thought I'd be late to school, 4th grade. My mother told me school was canceled and she said something about a building being hit. She probably said more, but I was just waking up and I didn't know what the World Trade Center was. Again, 4th grade, most of my life in Japan. So for some reason I thought she meant that my school got hit and exploded, and I freaked out so much. Then my mother just told me to watch TV. I'd also say 9/11. My parents weren't really the news-watching type, so seeing current events when I was that young, I was like 10, wasn't very common. I think that's one of the few days in our history when almost every single person had their TV on the news. I remember getting sent home from school, coming into the house, seeing a smoking building and my mom sobbing. I couldn't understand why she was so upset. I mean, buildings burn down all the time. Man, what I'd give to be that young and naive again. All I cared about was playing Pokemon, not international geopolitics. I was in middle school, and suddenly we were all called to the lunchroom. We had no idea what was going on. The teachers were all talking together and looking terrified. Rumors ran around in whispers. Finally, they announced that there was an incident in New York City and we would all have an early dismissal. They contacted all the buses and our contacts to pick us up. We were sent to the classrooms we were originally in before they rounded us up to announce buses and stuff. I had a Spanish class in high school and all high school rooms had TVs hanging from the ceiling. The teacher had the news on and we sat and saw the news from the beginning when they replayed the first plane crash. No one knew WTF was going on, and we were terrified. Mom picked me up and I was looking out at the sky. I lived near an airport and the sky was empty, except a bit later, I heard what sounded like jets fly over our house. At home, Mom called Dad freaking out, and he was at work worried about us. I had the news on and all of a sudden, me and my mom saw the second plane crash. We also saw the 2 towers fall. That was it. Terrified. The French Brothers documentary shows the faces of unbelief and terror we all had. It's on YouTube if you want. There was another documentary shown recently on TV. I forgot the channel. Brings a lot back. I'll never forget seeing the little shadows of people jumping, and the one person who was waving a white cloth for help eventually was bent over the window completely charred to death. Story 2. The OJ trial. My first distinct memory of watching a live nationwide news event unfold on live TV was not just the OJ trial, but specifically the police pursuit with the white Bronco. Very vivid memories of watching that unfold. I was on a camping trip with my dad deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains when that happened. He had brought this little portable, battery-powered TV that could pick up over-the-air broadcasts, kinda, because he wanted to try to watch the NBA Finals that were happening at the time. We were settled into our campsite for the evening, and I was reading when he suddenly told me that the game had been preempted by some police chase. The television signal was a bit fuzzy, so at first we were both like, did Bob Costas really just say that OJ is being chased by the police? But yes, that is exactly what was happening. It was surreal. I remember that day very well. I was an 11-year-old in Buffalo, New York, where OJ was a celebrity based on his time playing for the Bills. That day was also the day we went on a long-awaited field trip to Toronto. We went to the Science Center and Swiss Chalet. We got to ride on actual comfortable air-conditioned coach buses with reclining seats, not a school bus. None of this has any relevance to anyone else, but what a day to be alive. Summer and warmth was here. In a week, summer vacation will start. Juice was on the loose. It was a Friday night when OJ ran, so we could stay up late and not have school the next day. What an awesome day. I think my life peaked on that day, unfortunately. It just went downhill from there. I was in like 8th or 9th grade when this happened. Our teacher actually ran out of the room the second he heard about it, grabbed the lone TV on a cart thing, wheeled it into his room, and we all watched it for however long it lasted. When classes switched over, no one left. The next class came filing in and just found somewhere to watch it. We probably had 100-ish kids and 4 teachers crammed into that room, watching every detail intently until they finally called it for the day. The school fully stopped that day. It was wild. This is probably it for me. I remember my mom watching it on TV, and I didn't even know who O.J. Simpson was or why his trial was such a big deal. I do also remember when Clinton was elected, but I don't remember actually watching it on the news. I just remember that my mom took me with her when she went to vote that day, and it was interesting to me because I didn't know what voting was. I definitely do not remember Desert Storm though, so I think that covers it for the early 90s major events. Story 3. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. I remember my friend, who was a habitual liar at the time, telling me that the president got in trouble because a woman sucked his ween. I thought it was the most ridiculous thing that she had ever come up with. My mom blames Clinton for the moral downfall of America because of the oral sex scandal. Dude, I was 7, and the fact that it was oral sex totally evaded me. I just knew that Clinton had dated another woman while married. It's always amusing when people make comments like that. Let's just review what the 1950s through the 1980s were like. It was common for guys to grab a secretary's butt. Getting down with 15-year-olds was pretty widespread so long as you were under 25 or so. I'm older than many of you, and I remember when I was in high school, and this was common, mind you. There would be guys, obviously in their 20s, pulling up to pick up their high school girlfriends who were often 15, maybe 16 on a good day. Super common. My grandmother told me stories about when she was a teacher there. The principal would literally walk by putting his hand on the bare legs of certain female teachers and sometimes kind of wiggling them up their skirts. They would just giggle and laugh and slap him in the arm. That's not even getting into the really nasty stuff, like every woman that I'm friends with, and just generally speaking, they were born between 1965 and 1980, and have been molested at some point, all but 2 before they were even 10 years old. When you hear people talk about sexual values, I just reflect on what I grew up with and laugh when I see people my own age or sometimes older talking about America having lost its values, and gasping with their hands over their mouths about Bill Clinton. Gays, however, were heavily persecuted, looked down upon, and beat up. Lesbians were outcasts. So when people talk about the good old days, this is the perspective I remember. LOL. I remember hearing about that on talk radio my parents were listening to as they were driving. I wasn't even 5 years old at that point, and I'm sure my parents thought I was in my own little world, but I asked them about what was going on, and all I recall was that they were hemming and hawing about what to tell me and eventually settled on, the president did something wrong and then lied about it, so people are mad. Nice save, Mom and Dad. I came in to say the Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky debacle. I just remember my parents being up in arms about our President of the United States committing such a heinous and horrendous act. It almost seems tame by today's standards. That's wild to me, is that the way it was thought of, some dude cheating on his wife, is tame by today's standards. The last president did like 3 times or something. The wild part though is that everyone forgets Monica was 9 friggin' teen when she started at the White House and was 21 when this all blew up. Do you think a single 19-year-old young woman honestly had the option to say no to the most powerful man in the world who was her direct supervisor? And yet people were happy to tear this little homewrecker apart limb from limb in the media, and not the old rich white guy who abused his power in the sickest way. Story 4. I remember watching Princess Diana's funeral. I was about 6, I think. I was gonna say when she first got into a car accident. They stopped late-night TV to announce that it happened. That special report music is burned into my head from that point on. When I hear it, I know something big is going down. Yeah, I remember just from seeing my mom's reaction. We had just got home from a pleasant dinner or whatever, but I remember she turned on the TV when we got inside and that was all over the news. Saw her immediately go from a good mood to crying. Was rather startling from my perspective. I was an 8-year-old American kid and didn't even know who she was, but I guess from my mom's generation, Princess Diana was a huge deal, and that day was devastating. I was a bit older, about 12. I vividly remember my parents had some friends over and we, the kids, were watching TV. Every channel kept being interrupted until I finally went to my mom and said, I guess a princess died? The jovial chatting and cocktailing in the kitchen ended suddenly, and the TV was immediately commandeered from the kids to only watch CNN for the rest of the evening. Yes, the same. I had a friend who was only about 9 or 10, the same age as me at the time, and he was weirdly obsessed with her when she died. I remember going to his house and we would chill in his rooms while he showed me Women's Day magazines as they did a special on her. He also was obsessed with the Titanic after the movie was released. 30 years later, I Facebooked him, and it looks like they are still his two favorite interests. It's all harmless and he can like whatever. But the fact that this started when I was a little kid and held on to this out of everything else in his life is a little bit weird for me. Story 5. I'm old as hell. It was the moon landing. Yeah, but this one is amazing. A lot of these on here are depressing. Columbine, 9/11, the Challenger, but watching the moon landing is pretty amazing. I hope all of you know how lucky you are to have been able to watch something like that. I commented on the moon landing also, and I agree. It's interesting how the majority of the comments have been tragedies. Born in '64. I was born in '62 and watched the moon landings also. But I also remember the reporting on the Vietnam War every night of the evening news, and eventually the fall of Saigon. I have vague memories of the report, and of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassinations. I was really young, but I sort of remember the funerals being televised on TV. I was looking for this. Hello, fellow boomers. Born in 1961. I think this is my first real memory of something this epic. If I try really hard, I sometimes think I can remember JFK's funeral, but I'm not sure if it's a true memory or if I have just heard my family talk about it so much that I think I remember it. I would have been 2 years old. My birthday is July 20th, and it was my 6th birthday when the moon landing occurred. We were at the cottage, and it was our last day, so my parents were packing up, but I was really sick with that summer's ear infection, a regular occurrence in my life, so while my siblings were off having one last day of fun, I was huddled up in a sleeping bag with a little TV watching the moon landing. We got home, and my parents let me stay up and watch Neil Armstrong's first step, since I was too miserable to sleep anyway. I have been a total space nerd my whole life because of that moment. I got to watch a launch from Kennedy Space Center 2 years ago, one of the greatest moments in my life. Story 6. Probably the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was in my 20s at the time, and it was an amazing thing to see on TV as an adult and growing up during the Cold War. It slowly led up to it, I believe, over a week, until eventually they started tearing the wall down and nobody stopped them. My mom was in her mid-30s, and I remember it happening because of how she was reacting to it as the news reports ran. Just the utter shock and amazement that they were tearing it down. She visited the wall in her 20s when her sister and brother-in-law were stationed over there. My parents were in their 30s too, and it was their reaction that really made it memorable for me. They couldn't believe it. In college, I met a young woman about my age from East Germany. She said that what she remembered about the wall coming down was that her grandmother had gone and hid under the kitchen table crying when the news broke. The way everyone had gathered excitedly around the radios and TVs had upset her because the very same thing had happened at the beginning of World War II when she herself was a girl. It happened the year before I entered high school and pretty much defined my youth. Man, we could walk on water in the 90s. Was in Berlin this fall, finally, and I had to fight back tears several times. My entire childhood was living relatively close to the Eastern Bloc, and a feeling that the danger was real, suddenly it was over, and now last year, it suddenly is not over again. Oh, this is it. You get it. We were so confident in the 90s. The Cold War was over. We were going to save the whales and end racism, and stop polluting, and suddenly here we are. Yes, I feel you. I was about 9 when the wall went down. During my 20s, I studied the Cold War, truly thought it was history, that we had learned, and then last year happened. I just couldn't believe it. I still can't believe that they keep killing sons, fathers, moms, and sisters just for ideology. Pregnancy is so awful. Giving birth is so painful. Keeping babies alive and healthy takes so much time and energy. Raising them correctly is such a big investment of time, money, and patience. How can a government willingly sacrifice so many of its own people? I definitely didn't spend half of my life carefully raising my youth for them to be butchered in half of a second for the ego of a 70-ish delusional old man. Another thing that really sticks out in my mind is the Tiananmen Square massacre. Although it's been pretty much wiped out of history, I remember the protests leading up to the week before, and then the Chinese government forcing all the foreign journalists and reporters to leave the country. And then a day or two later, they cracked down on the students. There were sporadic videos that leaked and were shown on the news, and tons of eyewitness accounts. I even wrote a song about it because I was in a band at the time. Story 7. Definitely remember Steve Irwin dying. Does anyone else feel like it's super weird how everyone always talks to his kids about his death? Almost all the interviews and all the comments on everything they post are like, "Oh, your dead dad would be proud of you. How do you feel about your dead dad?" etc. I get that's how we know the kids, but it must suck to have such a sad part of your past brought up constantly. Maybe they think of it in a positive light, but I'd hate it. It wasn't the first that I remembered, but I bawled my eyes out. I felt silly because I had not ever met him IRL, but I felt like it was a catastrophic loss for the world and its wildlife. As a kid, I didn't think nature was even interesting until I saw The Crocodile Hunter on Animal Planet. Old Steve really made animals and nature appealing to young children, and it's one of the many reasons that man was an absolute treasure. Yeah, that one stung. I was a big fan of Steve Irwin as a kid, but I was only 4 when he died, so I can't really remember if I was a fan before or after. The first major story I remember seeing on the news is probably the Boston Marathon bombing. I was in the 5th grade and just remember being generally terrified and being sent home from school early. I've always thought of it as my generation's "what were you doing when X happened?" i.e. 9/11 for anyone who was actually alive then. Years before Steve Irwin died, I had a feeling that one day he was going to get killed by a wild animal. He got too close to deadly creatures. At times, it seemed like he was harassing them, but he was truly an animal lover at heart. Immediately after he died from the stingray barb to the chest, some people wanted to find that stingray and kill it, but others said, "No, this isn't what Steve Irwin would have wanted." Story 8. Shuttle explosion, Baby Jessica. I forgot all about baby Jessica McClure doing a split in the well. That was so scary, and it seemed like it took forever to get her out. I gotta go Google and see if she's okay. She got a toe amputated, but was okay other than that. But she did develop RA. They set up a trust fund for her, and she got $1.2 million when she turned 25. She is 37 now. Sadly, though, the guy who rescued her took his own life a few years ago. I only remember baby Jessica because I broke my leg while she was still recovering in the hospital. I got put in the children's wing on the same floor. The doctor who taught me to walk on crutches would bring Jessica to my room in a little red wagon someone had donated, and they had me pull her up and down the hall on my crutches. The parents/visitors waiting on that floor was a glassed-in area by the nurse's station, and it was filled to the ceiling with toys and balloons. I saw it as they brought me in, and I thought the toys were for anyone who had to be there. I was really confused and disappointed when I was told I couldn't pick one out because they were all for one girl. Weirdly, my folks taped the baby Jessica story, so I grew up watching it among other tapes from TV movies when we got bored. Now that I think about it, that may be where my fear of drains might have come from. Saw it live when I was 5, I think, and kept forgetting what it was and putting it on again. Everybody's Baby. I remember my dad made me watch it. I was in tears at the end. Then my dad told me it was based on a real story and little Jessica was real. He told me it was called Everybody's Baby because the entire world wanted to see her rescued. Just Googled it. The medic who saved her developed PTSD and committed suicide, so little Jessica was saved, but another tragedy happened. So sad. Story 9. The first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. Either that or the disastrous siege of the Branch Davidian cult compound in Waco, Texas. They both happened roughly around the same time. In 1993, I turned 10, and I must have become very aware of the news all of a sudden because I remember a ton of things from that year. The two you mentioned, the ongoing war in Yugoslavia, and strangely enough, a freaking Amtrak crash that I knew for absolutely certain happened in 1993. September 22nd, apparently, because I made a comment about it when the TV guide came in from the mail the first week in 1994. They had misprinted the date as 1993 still, and I said something along the lines of, "Nobody wants to repeat that year." My mom seemed disappointed to hear me say that, but damn, you're the one that watches the 5 p.m. news every day on the only TV in the house. These are the big ones I remember, along with Ruby Bridge. My stepdad was that special breed of crazy that was convinced the end of days was nigh. and had a bunker in the basement that he was stalking, while the 700 Club played constantly in the background. Oh crap, I remember both of those when I was a kid. I remember the Gulf War when was 6 in 1991 and Saddam was on TV. I also remember a lot of stuff happening in Northern Ireland. I'm Irish. Car bombs, riots, murders, kneecappings. I personally saw this happen. Can't remember which was first. The timeline is a bit vague. I remember both. The thing I remember though was in my 10-year-old mind, I was like, okay, someone set off a bomb in a tall building in New York City, but with the Branch David on siege, I was like, huh? Okay. Obviously, I didn't quite get what was going on in Waco when it was happening, and since I never asked questions, it was years later before I was, oh, okay, that was what was going on there. The story behind the dude who did it is pretty interesting. Watched the Mayday episode, and it turns out he tested a prototype bomb on an airplane in the bottom of a seat, where unfortunately a passenger absorbed the blast of the bomb and died. This took place in the Philippines. His henchman was planning on bombing big-time flights, but was stopped in time, and the perpetrator himself was obviously caught after becoming public enemy number 1 following the World Trade Center bombing. Apparently the dude was a genius in electronics engineering and chemistry. Shame talents like these were used for terrorism. Story 10. Columbine. My 5th grade teacher brought the paper in the next day after the shooting and just wept in front of us all. I don't think I remember any of the joys of that year, but I remember the profound sadness on that day. This was 9th grade for me, so there was a thick layer of dread coming back to school after it happened. Could it happen here? That one quiet guy always wears long jackets too. What would we do if/when we start hearing gunshots during math class, etc.? I was also one of the many alternative-looking kids who were called into the counselor's office so that they could practically screen us for signs of becoming potential shooters. I was in middle school in Littleton, Colorado, when Columbine happened. Granted, Columbia isn't actually in Littleton, it's an unincorporated part of the Denver metro, but Littleton was the closest city, so it was being reported taking place there. Definitely was a weird thing to see your town in the news so much for such a sad thing. Same, and I was 8, so not totally weird that it's the first big thing I remember, but it also happens that my grandmother was on staff, and my parents had me stay with the counselor all day. So it's less of a memory of news and more of a memory of a weird day at school. Story 11. OKC bombing. I was 9 and was glued to the TV for a couple of days as they continued to rescue people. It hit me hard when after several days, there were no more survivors. Only bodies that they didn't manage to reach in time. Grandma had her windows blown out. Aunt was thrown through a wall, building next door, and father slept through it. One of the best memorials in the country though. I've been every year up until last, and it has never failed to make me sob uncontrollably. I was just adding up all my memories of news events due to this thread, and it is so clear that fanatics of both religion and far-right ideology were responsible for so much pain, either directly or due to not establishing proper gun safety laws. If the CIA had something to do with the assassinations, it was because they were against the democratic leaders. Take that into consideration concerning our current dangers for democracy. JonBenet was the first one I thought of, but you're right, OKC was a year and a half earlier, and wow, do I remember it well. My mom was homeschooling us at the time, but had been a daycare instructor, so it was the first time I remember vividly realizing that bad guys didn't care about hurting kids or their moms. I was 8, so I'm sure I knew it was an abstract concept, but that drove it home. I was sick for days. This is mine too, though I was still very young and didn't understand. I just have this incredibly vivid memory of that infamous night, of the building torn almost in half. It was the first time I'd ever considered seeing the inside and outside of a building at the same time. Before that, they felt like separate worlds to me, like in a video game, but I didn't have that frame of reference yet. This was April of '95, so I would have been not quite 4 years old yet seeing that. I didn't know what had happened, just that clearly there'd been some sort of disaster that blew up a building. Honestly, I didn't really think about the people, but children are sociopaths that way sometimes. For me, it was like seeing a dissection, but for architecture. I just stared at the wide open building in awe and confusion. Later, I remember confusing that memory for Columbine. Oddly, Columbine happened much later in 1999, and by then, I was a lot more sentient and aware of the world. But I have absolutely no memory of seeing news about it. My parents wouldn't have been trying to hide it from me, I don't think, so either I was literally too busy being glued to the channels that played Pokemon anime, or just entirely overlooked it. I learned about it several years later on the darker parts of the web as a teen instead. Story 12. Sandy Hook. This isn't my first memory, but it was one of the first ones that changed my view of the world. I was in 8th grade and remember getting picked up by my grandfather after school, and when I walked into my grandparents' house, my grandma had it playing on the news. I was just thinking, wow, I went through my whole day while these young children were getting murdered, and had this realization that this could have been my school. And I think about it every time we have to do active shooter drills at the school I now work at. I was in 8th grade, and they took us into the gym. We had an assembly about it, and we were made to walk 28 silent laps to understand how many children had died. I don't have a good sense of understanding quantity, but that day, it really sunk in how many lives were taken, and how many subsequent lives were ruined. This is so morbid. I get that they wanted you to understand quantity, but 28 silent laps would just feel like a punishment to me when it already was so hard for school-aged kids to handle that news, because everyone felt like it could have been them. I was also in school at the time. It really was morbid. I don't know who came up with the idea, but I know that more than just our school did it to raise awareness. Like you said, everyone thought it could be them. Walking the laps sent a few to our guidance counselors, and to the nurse for panic attacks. I think it would have been more constructive to make cards or something physical to send to the community, instead of leaving already very distraught kids more time to think about what upset them. This was my first one too. My parents are both teachers and had 5 kids, including me, in school, so they were pretty freaked out. I remember a week after it happened, people started making bomb threats at my school, and my parents gave me the option to stay home, which as a kid I thought was awesome, and I was lucky I could stay home. I was in middle school, and I don't think I really understood how serious it all was. Me and my friends just got to stay home and play video games for like a week, so I was kinda happy. It's crazy thinking about it now. Story 13. Aberfan. I was 8, and even then realized how bad it was. 116 children and 28 adults died when a coal tip collapsed into a school in 1966. Me too. They were kids of our age. I later got to know an ex-para who'd been doing his basic training in the Brecon Beacons at the time. He and his troop had been co-opted to help dig out the bodies. They worked without stopping for over 24 hours, pulling dead children out of the slurry. My grandfather was living in a town nearby when it happened. It inspired him to become an engineer designing mines, so something like that would never happen again. He eventually got his PhD in mine engineering and worked for another country's government many times. Story 14. We just got a TV show in 1961, and all 2 channels were full of Premier Tommy Douglas trying to get the Saskatchewan provincial government to pass the Universal Health Care Act. It passed, and within a year or so, all the other provinces also accepted it. My mom was an MD, so it was a big topic in the house. Story 15. I remember that Vietnam was always on the news. Yes, as a kid in the 60s and 70s, I remember the evening news with lots of stories about the Vietnam War. There was even graphic coverage of people getting shot and killed. Back then, the news stations weren't afraid to show what war was really like. These days, you don't see anything like that because they censor it or don't show it at all. The Vietnam War ended when I was 13, and that was a relief to me because I knew I would have to sign up for the draft when I turned 18. Coverage of US military action is highly censored because of the uncensored coverage of the Vietnam War. Correspondents embedded with the troops are strictly controlled by the military. Vietnam was the first war when someone in the field with a motion camera could get footage and got it developed, transmitted and aired on TV while it was still time. The visceral revelation that war is indeed hell was part of the widespread resistance to that war in that era. Story 16. In the town where I grew up, there was a guy everyone knew called Corn Dave, and they also hated him because he would whip corn at everyone's car. Sometimes it was just the little yellow dots that you pulled from the main stick, but sometimes he would throw the whole corn at your car with the green leaves and everything. My dad would always say, "Corn incoming," so the thumps of the corn wouldn't bother us when we were riding in the back of his car. So anyway, on the news one day, the reporters came on and said Corn Dave was missing. The reporter was crying, and I was 11 when it happened, so I called the news station a few times until I got them to put the reporter on the phone. And when he said hello to me, I said, "They should call you Crying Dave." It wasn't the reporter's name, it was a reference to Corn Dave. I thought it was funny as a kid, but I think the reporter cried some more. Sorry. We found out later that they found Corn Dave's body in a creek, and someone had filled his mouth with corn. The reason I remember the story is because my dad said, "Sounds like someone finally creamed corn." Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these that you would like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.